Welcome to Bible study. This is the Bible study which we are preparing for December 21st, 2025. Fourth Sunday of Advent. We are really looking forward to Christmas here. We look forward to seeing you at one of our Christmas services, either at 7:30 on Christmas Eve or 10 o'clock on Christmas Day. We've been looking at the Apostles' Creed, and particularly Luther's explanation of it, in which he speaks of God as the Creator, first article. Last week we looked at Psalm 104, which put us into what I thought was the proper place that Luther wants us to be as we come to that, and that is to note God's creative work in the establishment of all creation, but also God's ongoing and critical importance to the maintenance of our lives, to the sustenance of them, and to their continued thriving health, and even ultimately to our resurrection. But you can't come to the doctrine of creation without having a little bit of a intersection, if you will, with Genesis chapter 1. And I wanted to leave it until a little bit farther in because I think we need to be in that right place for it, but I think we're there. And so let's talk a little bit about the first chapter of Genesis. As I noted in our last session, I think that this chapter of Genesis is oftentimes the occasion for far more smoke than light, far more discussion and fight than it is actually about focusing our attention on God and on what He has done and what He is about. A lot of that is particularly germane to our modern period. Ever since the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, there have been a vigorous and ongoing debate about how to read this passage. And I really don't want to go into that. I just don't think it's terribly fruitful and helpful. Rather, what I would like to do is look deeply at the passage of Genesis 1. And I want to ask, what does it seem to be saying to us? What does it mean for you and me? Now, I think it's important to remember that this debate that we're having now did not start with Darwin's publication of the Origin of Species. It's been going on for a long, long time. As far back as the days of Moses and in the exile and in the first century and in the third and the fourth and the fifth centuries of the Christian era, we have had people asking deep questions about this and asking hard questions about it. It is probably in that context you should be aware that the people who wrote our creed, we don't know who wrote the Apostles' Creed, but when they came to write the Nicene Creed in 325, we have a lot better idea of who that was. They also refrained from wading into this. They simply said, "I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth." They did not assert a how or a why. They asserted that God did it. That was the important part to them. So let's come back to Genesis chapter 1 and take a look at that. We don't know exactly when this was written. Moses may have done it, in the second millennium BC. Some people believe this was a later addition to the Torah at the time of the exile. I don't know about that. It's given to us at the beginning of this text, and I'm going to receive it there. In the context, though, of the ancient world, it doesn't really matter, because in the ancient world, there were competing ideas about where this creation comes from, and particularly competing ideas about how it came about. The most important ones were coming out of Egypt and Babylon, or the Fertile Crescent before Babylon. They involved a creation that that was born out of a great conflict between the gods. Finally, one god was able to prevail. In the Babylonian epic, he took his enemy, a great dragon named Tiamat, who was the goddess of chaos, and he took her corpse after he had slain her, and he cut her in half, and he split that into two parts, a top and a bottom, and that in-between part is where they imagined people lived, that the half of her corpse was the ground on which we walked and the waters below, and then the other half was the sky above. And that we were essentially living in this corpse of a slain goddess. Likewise, the Egyptians had similar kinds of narratives. We don't know those quite as well as the Babylonian epic, but they too, we find evidence of them that they had very similar kinds of narratives. It was a bloody, chaotic, and really that the creation was something of an afterthought. Inside the Babylonian epic, we find that they had this place. They go, well, now what do we got to do with it? And Marduk, the great god of the Babylonians, decides that he uses some blood and he creates people so that they can be his slaves. There you go. That's your creation narrative. It is in that context that we need to read Genesis chapter 1. That there was a context in which they imagined the world came out of bloodshed and violence and chaos, and Genesis 1 comes in with this very different image, with this very different picture. And we're going to talk at the end a little bit about how that might speak to some things today. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The first thing you notice about this in comparison to the other creation narratives from the ancient world is that there's only one God involved. That God isn't in a war or a conflict. It starts out very serenely. You have the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, over these chaos. That there is no competitor. There isn't this near thing of an existential battle fought between these various gods and from which comes this world in which we live. No, it is God and God alone. And he is the sole actor here. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. I want you to notice the calmness and the serenity of this. That God creates something, it appears. God calls it good. He then arranges it, separates night from day, and you have evening and you have morning, the first day. There's no conflict. There's no chaos. In fact, if anything, this is more of an ordering of the chaotic elements into, here, we're making order out of this. Day 2, you see that God says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was an evening and there was morning the second day. The second day of creation is God has this sort of great big blob of water. There's light and there's darkness, but there's water here. And he separates this sort of primordial element, top from bottom. And he makes the sky and he makes the ground we walk on. There's some resonance with that story of Marduk slaying or cutting Tiamat in half and doing that. Some people have noticed that. It's actually etymologically the same word, but notice the difference. This is God simply creating space. God said, let the waters in the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is in their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth the vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And so you now have the waters below being divided into ocean and into land. God causes plants to grow, and they grow. God said, let there be, and there is. And everything is just sort of proceeding right along according to plan. We come to the fourth day. He's going to make the sun, the moon, and the stars, put them into the heavens to mark the times and the days and the seasons. Again, God's going to say, and it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the next day. And then we're going to see God create in the next day the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky. And then there's evening and there's morning the next day. And finally, on the sixth day of creation, God is going to create the animals and people. Now, there's evening, there's morning, and there's sixth day, and then it says on the seventh day he rested. Now, if we look at that and just put that into that ancient world context, we have a creation that is one very different. As we've noted, it's calm, it's serene, but there's also a bit of punch in here too. Because of course, Marduk was considered the sun god. And as in Egypt there were gods of the sun and the moon and the various constellations and stars, those were considered deities in their world. But notice here, God makes them. God doesn't even make them the first day. Oh, he made them on the fourth day. And all of these things that these people are worshiping are in fact simply things that God has put into order, into good order. God has called them good, but they are not God. And this is one of the great contributions of, I think, Genesis 1, is that it really defines idolatry for us. Is that idolatry has several different forms, but one of its most prevalent forms is when you confuse the creator with the creation. And this is exactly what the Babylonians and the Egyptians were doing when they worshiped the sun and they worshiped the moon as gods. They were confusing the creator with the creation. Now, there's a couple of other very interesting things to notice. That the creation narrative, we've highlighted it a couple times. It has a rhythm and it has a pattern to it. God said, "Let there be," and there was. God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning. By the way, Jewish day, and across the ancient world, really, day began at sundown. There was evening, and there was morning, would be the way of saying from beginning to end. There was evening and morning, and there was day, and it was the next day. This is, by the way, why we celebrate Christmas Eve. Because we still remember that biblical way of understanding a day, so that once the sun goes down on Christmas Eve, on the 24th, really the day of Christmas has begun, and we can't wait till the next morning to celebrate it. We come together on Christmas Eve. But there's another very interesting thing that I think a lot of people miss. If you were to take a chart and just chart out the days of creation and say, okay, day 1, he makes light. Day 2, he makes the sky and the sea. And day 3, he makes the land with its plants and trees and things like that. And then you go to day 4, he makes sun, moon, and stars. And day 5, he makes birds and fish. And day 6, he makes animals and people. Well, if you notice, there's actually a pair of triads going there. Day 1, light. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars. Day 2, sky and sea. Day 5, birds and fish, the things that live in the sky and the sea. And then in day 3, he makes the land with its plants, and then on day 6, he makes the people and the animals that eat those plants and the fruits and the seeds that they produce. So there's also very much an idea that this is very carefully planned, and that God has worked his creation in a way that is very deliberate. This is not God reacting to some violent war with the forces of chaos, nor is this God sort of moving along by the seat of his pants. And that's really the way the Babylonian epic portrays it, that they kind of got done with creating the space, and they said, well, and they said, what are we going to do with it? And that's nice. And they said, well, then they're going to make people, and they're going to become our slaves within it. But they're all kind of making this up as they go along. But you get the very real sense that on day 1, God knew what was going to happen on day 6. And that this was all according to this very serene, calm, conflict-free plan that God had made. Just a little bit of interpretational history here. In the ancient world, there were people who were, they looked at the ancient world, and they looked around them and said, wow, this looks really old. It doesn't quite comport with what I read in my Old Testament. That isn't the way it looks. And there were lots of people trying to answer that. You had some people who would be very similar today to what you would hear from a kind of a fundamentalist read of it that says, no, it was about 6,000 years ago, and no, it was with in a literal 6 days. They wanted to read this document very literally. You had people saying that. One of them would be a theologian in one of the Cappadocian fathers by the name of Basil. He preached this series of sermons called the Hexameron, and that's kind of, he tried to make sense of that. At the same time, living on the other end of the Mediterranean Sea was another fellow whose name may be familiar to you, by the name of Augustine. And Augustine read the same document, and he said, I don't know that that's quite what it says. And I'm rather attracted to Augustine's ideas here. He said, I really think verse 1 is the creation narrative, that it is that God created the heavens and the earth. That's where God makes it. That these next things, where it talks about the 6 days, he says, I noticed that it never uses the word create in there, and it doesn't. But that it seems to be talking about God's plan. And so Augustine believed that God made the world in a moment. He didn't need 6 days, but that the 6 days are there to explain to us God's plan. It's like each day, time he turned the page on the plan, it was another day. And he says that in that sense, I think day is a device, a logical device for explaining this plan. Now, you don't have to agree with Augustine on that, but I wanted you to be aware that there have been a lot of different answers to how to understand this text that faithful people have put forward for thousands of years now. So what does it say to us today? Well, I think some of the same things. Because if you look at the narrative of a reductive materialism, and that's what you call that Darwinian evolutionary theology, is a reductive materialistic understanding of it. That is, that there simply has always been this matter, and that somehow it sort of self-organized and got itself put together and life formed, and that out of that life, through over vast stretches of time, it self-organized again, and it became, through random processes, well, people and dogs and cats and lions and penguins and all of these things we see around us. I think both of those ideas, whether you talk about I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, or whether you're talking about Darwin's, explanation for how this works, I think both of them require a tremendous faith. That you have to make some enormous leaps and just accept some things. And they probably don't even comport with experience. Now, Darwinian evolution is a theory that has an enormous potency to it, in that it's able to predict a number of things. I think Darwinian evolution is certainly worth studying, but I don't believe it. And here I need to be very careful with that word. We're sloppy with it. In fact, I don't think I know of a single scientist, many of whom are atheists, who are completely committed to Darwinian evolution being the explanation for the age and the processes of the earth and the origins of it. But they don't believe it. Because believing is that thing into which you entrust yourself. I think they would say, I know that Darwinian theory explains a number of things, or can describe a number of things about this world in which I live. And I, as a Christian, can absolutely say that. Yes, it does. It absolutely does. But I don't believe it. I don't believe it explains why I'm here. I don't believe it explains where I'm going. And I don't think it adequately explains even the meaning or the purpose of this creation or myself. It's a very useful thing for explaining why we, flowers, all right, or the interrelationship between the pollinators and the pollen and the pollen producing plants. Sure. But does that tell me really where it comes from? No. And here's where I think the creation narrative can be very helpful for us. I think what it can tell us is that you have purpose. You have a meaning to your life. You are not, well, in the ancient terms, chaotically created, or maybe here, randomly created. You are not simply another mote of dust in a vast universe that when you die, the universe will pay absolutely no attention to it. But rather, the creation narrative can tell us that God sees this world and this universe in which we live, and He called it good. And He said, I like it. It is very good. That's what He says at the end of it. In chapter 2, Moses goes on to explain, well, here's what we're going to say about man and about this humanity. He narrows the focus down to people. But in this first chapter, as he explains the cosmos, he's saying something actually really important, I think, for people today. As we start to see a lot of people who are really adrift and aimless, who have no sense of meaning or purpose to their lives, who are oftentimes dying what we call deaths of despair. God says something else. You are important. You are known. You are purposeful and meaningful. You are important. Let's talk more about this on Sunday if you get the chance. We'll see you there.